Now what? This is the question that we are asking today in this conversation about accountability and leadership in planning a feminist future. On behalf of RIKK, Institute for Gender, Equality and Difference, and the Gender Equality Studies and Training Program, also known as the GEST program, at the University of Iceland, I would like to welcome you all to the third talk of the 2021 Spring Term Conversation Series. My name is Irma Erlingsdóttir and I am a project manager in RIKK. Now the topic of the series is Me Too Thinking Ahead, and it follows up on two recent books on Me Too. Firstly, the fifth book in RIKK's book series Fléttur, which is in Icelandic, and is edited by me, Þorgerður Þorvaldsdóttir and Kristín Pálsdóttir. And secondly, the Routledge Handbook of the Politics of the Me Too movement, edited by Irma Erlingsdóttir, director of RIKK and GEST, and Giti Chandra, research specialist at GEST. Today's speakers both have chapters in the book, the handbook that is, and Giti will be moderating their discussion here today. The session brings together Karen Boyle and Audrey Roofeh. Karen Boyle is a professor of feminist media studies at the University of Strathclyde in the UK, where she runs the Applied Gender Studies program. And Audrey Roofeh is an employment attorney and the CEO of Mariana Strategies, a workplace culture consulting firm. Their conversation today will focus on accountability and leadership, and we will be taking questions in the chat, so you can send in your questions to me or to Giti, or raise your hand if you would like to voice your question yourselves. And with that, I give the words over to Karen.
Hi there. Now what I think is a really important question, and it demands that we move forward. So I think it's the right question, but there's another question, or perhaps a cry of despair, that I've found it very difficult to get beyond in thinking about what I wanted to say today. And that's not again. This week has brought particularly vivid reminders of the persistence of violent misogyny, certainly in a UK context. In the UK, we're experiencing a Me Too resurgence just now, an explosion of women's testimony about men's violence and the fear of that violence in relation to street harassment specifically. And the context of that has been the abduction and murder of a woman, Sarah Everard, walking in London on March the 3rd. Last week, a serving police officer was charged with her abduction and murder, and it's also been revealed that there was a previous complaint of indecent exposure against him. So not again. And of course, since I started thinking about this, 8 people, 6 of whom were women of Asian descent, were murdered by a 21-year-old man in Atlanta. Not again. Yeah, I think if we do want to turn that not again from a declaration of despair to one of intent, this will not happen again, then we do need to keep asking, now what? Now there are lots of answers to that question, but I'm a media scholar, and so part of what I want, or my answer to that question, is often in relation to representation, which can seem frivolous when we're talking about these kind of real world cases. But I hope that today I'll suggest the importance of stories and the way we tell these stories about men's violence against women generally. And probably what I'll focus on most is the testimonial hashtag. And I use that phrase testimonial hashtag to refer to hashtags like Me Too, which I've written about in the context of the Routledge Handbook, and also my own book, Me Too, Weinstein and Feminism. But this week, in the UK context, the hashtag most in my mind is She Was Walking Home, or She Was Just Walking Home, which has been widely used by women responding to the Sarah Everard murder. Now, the media coverage of the disappearance and murder of Sarah Everard raised a lot of depressing questions about who's accountable for men's violence. And perhaps not surprisingly, there was a lot of victim blaming discourse, particularly in the first days after her disappearance, where there was some emphasis on safety advice to women on what we could do to stop ourselves being assaulted. One of the responses to that was an outpouring of testimony relating to both street harassment and the safety precautions that we routinely take in public space. And that's partly where the hashtag "she was just walking home" was being used. Now, I think the hashtag there, really its intent was to take the sting out of the media attention to Sarah's behaviour. Yes, she was walking home, but haven't we all done that? But I think it also has some worrying side effects, because whose behaviour does it make our narrative focus? She was just walking home is a story about women's behaviour, and it led to pleas in some quarters, including in a police statement, for women not to overreact, not to get hysterical, because the threat of this kind of violence, of what happened to Sarah Everard, or I should say what was done to her, is actually relatively rare. So in that context, asserting the ordinariness of our safety work, its difficult and exhausting nature, is important. But I do worry that there's this unintended side effect that we're still focusing on women's behaviour, what we do, are our reactions appropriate? And it's also important to note that at least part of the reason for the media prominence of the murder of Sarah Everard are racialised and class dynamics that allow her to function as a kind of every woman. And of course, not every woman functions as an every woman in that way. Economies of both attention and value are in themselves deeply racialised, classed, and sexualised. But one thing that I think often gets lost in discussions of testimonial hashtags like Me Too or She Was Just Walking Home are the way that these, so one thing that gets lost when they're talked about, I think, as digital feminist activism is the extent to which this is mediated speech, mediated by the affordances of the platform, by algorithmic attention, and by narrative devices. And I think this is important because by considering mediation, we can critique patterns without criticising individual social media users for adding their testimonies. We can express concern with the imperative to testify on the one hand, and with how these hashtags are then themselves extracted from that thread to become decontextualised, individualised, free content for media organisations. And this brings me on to leadership, the other aspect of what we're going to talk about today. Now, of course, testimony, speaking out, breaking the silence, survivor discourse, testimony and leadership should not be mutually exclusive, but nor should they be necessarily conjoined. Yes, discursive activism exists, but discourse, including survivor discourse, is not always or necessarily activism. Now, when I say that, I'm not making a value judgment, and I think it's really important to stress that. But I'm asking, why should survivors have to be activists or feminists? Why should the heavy lifting of ending men's violence against women be placed on their shoulders? So what I'm expressing here really is a frustration with the media, the mainstream media's fetishisation of the personal and marginalisation of expertise. And if I give you one example, it might help to illustrate this, and it relates to Tarana Burke, who I'm sure you'll all be familiar with as the founder of the Me Too movement. Now, when Me Too, the hashtag, broke in October 2017, Tarana Burke was not initially part of the media conversation about Me Too. But following the online work of Black women, she did subsequently, the online work to correct that, she did subsequently become quite a significant figure in mainstream media accounts of Me Too. But her admittance to this story, and this is how I introduced her too, her admittance to this story was as the founder of the Me Too movement. And she commented on this herself on social media, saying that she was being presented as a founder, but not as a leader. It was, she says, like she'd discovered something 12 years earlier, which suddenly gained value, if you like, when Hollywood noticed. And that erased the work with and for survivors that she'd been doing in those 12 years. And the origin story, in terms of what I want to talk about today, the origin story was at least partly a story about Burke herself as a survivor. So for the media, I think at that stage in her story, her identity as a survivor trumped her identity as an activist and kept her rooted in the past, the founder, not the leader. She wasn't approached by most mainstream media organisations as an expert, but rather she was asked for her opinion often her opinion of the work of other women, not for her knowledge, her experience, her expertise, I mean her professional experience there, or her understanding. Now, this distrust of feminist expertise is something I've investigated more broadly in relation to the reporting of the Weinstein case. And I have a chapter in Me Too, Weinstein and Feminism where I look at news media reports in English where Weinstein and feminism were mentioned in the same report in the first month the story broke, and then again around the time of the Golden Globes. And what I found was that feminism was really used as a site of suspicion. So feminism in mainstream media reporting was where Weinstein himself was claiming to be a feminist, or where feminism was invoked as a site of suspicion because of the behaviour of women so-called feminists like Hillary Clinton or Meryl Streep and their relationships with Weinstein. What I found was that feminist organisations were largely missing. So that sense of feminism as a movement, as a structure, as the work that has been going on before Me Too, if you like, was often missing. And I'm seeing versions of that at the moment in response to Sarah Everard's murder and some of the vigils, for instance, that have taken place since then. There's an awful lot of media commentary, both in mainstream media and on social media, about are women behaving appropriately? Should we be saying or doing this? Is this the feminist thing to do? And do you know what? I'm kind of done. I don't want women to keep having to say Me Too, and I don't want to debate whether we should say Me Too. I want there to be a memory of all the women who have said this before, and not just since the Me Too hashtag went viral, but for the previous 4, even 5 decades. And I want that to be the basis on which we build without the continued need to subject survivors to speaking out in the public sphere. Now, I hope it's clear that what I'm not calling for here is any kind of re-silencing of survivors, but instead it's a call to listen to what has already been said. Yes, there will still be more to be said, and we must continue to listen, but the need for action has already been established. And the last thing really is that I want us to trust experts. And I'm not just thinking here of academic experts, although obviously I have a vested interest in that, but more acutely, I'm really thinking of frontline experts and researchers, the Tarana Burkes. Yes, they may also be survivors, but it's their knowledge, their expertise, their understanding, their leadership, which I want to acknowledge, learn from, and yes, even celebrate. I don't need to hear what was done to them again, because I believed them the first time. And I just want to end by saying there's also experts whose research and frontline work massively informs my own, whose personal stories I don't know, and I don't need to know them to appreciate their expertise. So I suppose what I'm saying then is we don't necessarily need more stories, we need different ones. And then thinking about what we do with those stories, I think is something that Audrey's going to be able to pick up on. So I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Karen. That's just so much to think about there and so beautifully articulated. I'm going to give the floor to Audrey. Audrey, the mic is yours. And, yes, once you're done, then we'll throw it open to a conversation.
Thank you so much. And I really want to start with something that Professor Boyle led with. I really appreciated the phrasing of turning not again from a declaration of despair into one of intent. And I'm here to talk about accountability. So I appreciate this opportunity to talk about the progression, and I'll be speaking about the particulars of the issues of sexual harassment, sexual violence in the workplace. And I'm sure folks here have heard the saying that when you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. I was trained as an attorney in the United States, and if you know any American lawyers, you'll see that to us, every problem is a nail, and the law is the hammer. I'm a practitioner. My firm is hired by companies to come in, assess problems of workplace harassment and discrimination, and make recommendations. We come in, we hear the stories, the experiences of harassment, even sexual violence, microaggressions. And what I'm going to tell you is how people in positions of power in the United States have framed the problem of harassment at work. And I'm here to tell you that their framing is wrong. For decades, the drive has been towards avoiding lawsuits and using that as a measure of whether there's a harassment problem or a discrimination problem in a workplace. That's a faulty measure, because the tools that we use to prevent liability are not the tools we use to make people safe at work. Is our goal avoiding liability, or is it making people safe at work? Decision makers in businesses aren't usually being asked that question that way. And when we do ask it, they look around and say, well, we're not hearing about a problem, so people must feel safe. What we haven't had and what we're working towards now is accountability for wrongdoing, for the big and the small in the workplace. So I want to briefly describe what this hammer is that we have here in the United States when it comes to workplace harassment. It's the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Under which we have created the ability to end discrimination on the basis of sex. It makes it illegal to discriminate on the basis of sex, gender, race, disability, ethnicity, and more in the workplace. That's the hammer. And in 1986, the United States Supreme Court ruled for the first time that an employee could bring a lawsuit alleging workplace sexual harassment under that law. The long and the short of the story is that a perverse set of incentives were created. A business could avoid liability and punitive damages by having trainings, by showing a good faith effort to ensure compliance and prevent workplace harassment. But what that meant is that there's a strange market for these services, a market for trainings that are not necessarily the best training, but what's recognizable as a harassment training to a court when a business gets sued. No wonder it hasn't worked, right? The solutions weren't set up to be solutions at all. So what's the solution? What's the better tool? For us, the better tool, and what we've known, and interestingly, this comes from a United States government agency that's charged with enforcing this element of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that agency is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which noted in 2016 that the focus of preventing harassment has to be a holistic approach that centers workplace culture to understand how an organization is preventing harassment and addressing problems as they arise. So what they found and what they said was the most important lesson they learned from their study over the course of a few years leading up to a report issued in 2016 was that employers have to have a holistic approach that will prevent harassment. And what we know, again, here we are with our hammer, so many state legislatures aiming to change the problem and create a big response to Me Too in the years after 2017, is that it's very difficult for states to pass laws that force change within a business's culture. It's not going to happen that way. So what we have seen is that, and this is a very helpful tool, if you have one takeaway from this part of my discussion, it should be this. Research shows that workplace climate is a predictor of whether harassment will happen. So if workplace climate is the sense of what you do when nobody's looking, what are the unsaid expectations in a workplace? If the unsaid expectations say that it's okay to make a comment about the way people look in the workplace, to touch them inappropriately, you're going to have a harassment problem. When it's not tolerated, organizations have less of a problem. That is a very easy guiding principle that goes to accountability in workplaces. So what that means in practice is what we know. People have to be held accountable for when they are behaving inappropriately in the workplace. And it is as simple as that. Businesses need to implement systems of accountability at an organization-wide level. And that includes a safe and effective reporting system, thorough workplace investigation system, proportionate corrective actions, and then the ability to have conversations about difficult topics. And that means that's truly at the heart of what our work needs to be when it comes to workplace harassment and prevention, is that we're having conversations that allow workplaces to become inclusive. In order to have a truly safe workplace, it must be inclusive. If you want people to thrive, you can't stop there. The workplace has to be equitable. It can't be a process that just focuses on the experience of sexual harassment or just on people who identify as women. The approach within the workplace has to be intersectional. It has to understand the experience of individuals and not make assumptions about their backgrounds. And this element of accountability in workplace culture and creating that safety doesn't happen unless we're asking uncomfortable questions and creating environments where it's possible to have ongoing discussions about these questions that maybe began with the discomfort. At every turn, and this is the second most important point about this work, at every turn, the question has to be, what is the impact of our actions and our efforts, putting aside our intent? Where can we go? What needs to happen, and what we've seen from the research, is that moving more women and women of color into positions of management is the best way to reduce harassment and discrimination in workplaces. In those workplaces where women have significant representation in core positions, harassment is less likely to occur. And in the same framing, in intersectional framing, centering individuals who have experienced harassment, as Professor Boyle mentioned, considering the expertise and understanding and hearing from people who have expertise is crucially important. And that creates the innovation in responses to workplace harassment when we're centering those who haven't been in the center. And there's some great practical examples of that in the United States, looking at the Fair Food Program to prevent sexual assault in agricultural work in Immokalee, Florida, is one example alone. Interesting solutions in the restaurant industry with color-coded responses for dealing with harassment by customers in the moment. What we see is that if we're not focusing on accountability, all the rest of this is the fluff that's created when we're focusing on liability prevention. Again, coming back to that, impact over intent as a driving principle for change in workplace harassment. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. That's just, it's so wonderfully clearly put out. And it's so easy, so simple when you say, this is what you need to do. And yet, of course, as you pointed out, in your chapter on the book, years and years and years of laws and mechanisms just haven't made a dent on it. I'm going to let the two of you carry this conversation further. And I will just jump in as and when needed.
Thank you so much, Giti. I wanted to start with a question to you, Professor Boyle. Very struck by the notion that we're not focusing on the behaviors that actually need to stop to end violence against women. And that's not what women choose to wear. It's not what time they choose to walk the streets. So if I'm coming at the question of workplace accountability as one, don't harass, hold people accountable when they do. What are you seeing as the most important elements for what we should be focusing on when it comes to, for instance, the safety of women walking the streets?
I think so much of what you said really spoke to that, though, because it did put accountability where accountability belongs. And in some ways, I suspect, I was about to say that's easier to do in a legal system, and I don't mean it's easy. I don't mean that at all. And we know the battles, but actually the sort of pernicious, the stuff you're talking about workplace cultures, actually, right? That pernicious stuff is actually much more difficult to change because so much of it is so normalized that we don't necessarily see, and that's what really troubled me last week about the "she was just walking home" hashtag, because those were statements of solidarity, support, they were testimonies. It was incredibly moving and powerful. And yet I just kept going, yeah, but what she was doing doesn't matter. What if she hadn't just been walking home? What if she'd gone out to buy cigarettes or alcohol? Or what if she was on her way to work in a strip club? What if, and all those kinds of things just really kind of sort of got it. So I think we'd actually, although we're talking about other different things, we're coming at it from some of the same way, that actually changing culture is difficult because it's not just a problem, if you like, of them and us. We're all part of the problem and the solution, because actually so much of the way we think about men's violence against women, whether it's in the context of sexual harassment or street harassment and murder, even as I was talking about, so much of the way we think about it has this normalized assumption that in order to think about it, we look at women's behavior, and we reproduce that in our own language. And I mean, anytime I try and write or speak on this, I find myself doing this. So like I was talking earlier to someone about the horrific case we've had in the UK this last week, and I was talking about what happened to Sarah Everard, and I kind of caught myself going, wait a minute, what happened to her? A happening doesn't have an agent. I write on this stuff all the time, and yet you still fall into those traps. And so I think another thing that connects our work really, Audrey, in this is also that sense of that we can't challenge one part of it without challenging the whole. And I was really struck and encouraged by what you were saying about really having to have this broader critique of inequality. And so I guess part of challenging workplace cultures then, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this, are how do we challenge workplace cultures? So yes, training might be part of that, but what attention do we have to the language used in policy documents, to the images used on corporate websites, to where people are taken for client meetings, all those kind of things? How do we make all of that not necessarily the legal tool, but how do we change those bits of the culture in order that you can then leverage your hammer effectively?
I love that question. And it's something that we try to think about when we see this done poorly. People are asking for, tell me what to say, tell me what not to say. Just give me a rule book so I don't have to think. And we back away slowly and say, you're not going to get anywhere unless you're starting from a principle of empathy. And for every example that you identified in when we're talking about workplace culture, if you can't ask yourself, how does this sit with the person who's experiencing their workday after the shootings in Atlanta, right? If I can't put myself in the shoes of the folks I work with and say, you've experienced a year of anti-Asian violence in this country because of people in high positions of power, our former president making racist comments about it. How does this sit with you today? If I can't sit there and ask, how does this feel to someone else? That needs to be done at every turn. And what people, there's a two-pronged issue that they face in that situation, which is they're afraid of being embarrassed or branded as a racist, a sexist, a homophobe in the workplace. And you say, if you can't get past that fear, you will never make this change. You will never be able to decenter the elements of culture that are in power at the center of an organization. If you can't have a real true space where people are able to have a conversation about their experience. And that is so crucially important when it comes to changing workplace cultures.
I mean, I completely agree with that, with a kind of caveat in a way, which is, I think the point about empathy is really, really important. And I've learned a huge amount this morning looking at tweets from people using various hashtags around what's happened in, I did it again, what's happened in Atlanta. I did it again. Yeah, I took away the agency of the perpetrator. We fall into that so easily. Mm-hmm. But about the murders in Atlanta. So I've learned a lot from what people have been generously sharing about their experiences on social media. At the same point in time, a lot of that information was already out there, and I would never want to put pressure on anyone to feel. I worry about what I'll refer to often as kind of the imperative to speak out, and that imperative to speak out is consistently put on the most impacted who are often the most marginalised, not always, but often. So the pressure to speak out is put on, like, as though we have to continually bear witness. And there was a campaign. Sorry, we do need to continually bear witness. What we don't need to do is continually bare our souls in that sense. And there was a campaign that followed on from Me Too, produced by, I think it was the Creative Coalition. There was a number of celebrities urging to keep telling people, and that was its slogan, that we must keep telling people. And, you know, and there's been a bit of criticism of this in a number of spheres. And I suppose partly what I'm saying is, no, we don't. We've been told. You know, we've been, to slip into broad Glaswegian for a minute, we've been told we need to do something about it, you know, and I think, so I completely agree with you. At the same point in time, I never want to be in a position where the onus is being placed on the people most affected or marginalised to be the ones to tell us what we need to do to solve the problem, because that evidence is out there. But I think it does then come back to that question about this has to be a wholesale cultural change, and actually working on every single bit of that is important. And you know how sometimes, like, all the different bits of what you're doing just kind of explode together in your head and you go, oh, I can see the connection with everything. At the moment, I'm working on a project with a great campaign called Pass the Mic, which is looking to increase the representation of women of colour, and particularly women of colour experts in Scottish media. And we did a monitoring report before Christmas. We looked at a week's worth of news coverage in Scotland, and expertise was one of the things we focused on. And that's partly what I was thinking about today, is the continued marginalisation of women as experts in every sphere. It's not just sexual violence, it's also the economy. It's coronavirus, it's, you know, employment law, it's whatever is being talked about in the media. We are not seeing women as experts. So when a case like, you know, the murder of Sarah Everard hits the news, we've got this disproportionate focus on women as victims, and we don't have other stories that sit alongside that show us women as experts. And those things are connected. It might seem tenuous, but they are connected, because that's why the victimisation becomes so acute, I think, is part of what's going on there.
Wow, I was just listening to both of you. It's such a pleasure, even though we're talking about such unpleasurable things. I was just wondering, you know, when we're talking about accountability in different spaces, in the workplace, I guess there's a way in which you can define who's accountable for what. Like, who will be liable for what. There are complaints mechanisms, there are laws, there are policies, and so on. But on the streets, who is accountable? Who do we hold accountable in different spaces? Are we thinking urban planning? Do we want more cameras? Do we want more street lights? Are we thinking policemen? Are we thinking law enforcement? Is that whom we should hold accountable? How do accountability, you know, demands or measures function in different spaces? I mean, in the home, we know, well, there's domestic violence and we know who we're going to hold accountable for that. But what about public spaces? What about the streets? Who does Sarah Everard hold accountable?
I mean, the man who murdered her, if this man is, obviously it's a live case, you've got to be very careful what you say.
Yes.
But if the man who is currently charged with her murder is the man who murdered her, then he's the person who should be held accountable. But there are still other issues of accountability that are to do with urban planning, for instance. You know, so it doesn't have to be an either or. Right. We need to hold the individuals. So I think, you know, in terms of a lot of what you were saying about questions of liability as well, I think that's really, really interesting, because there is an assumption in the workplace that the employer is liable as well as an employee who is behaving in a way that may be deemed to require disciplinary action or something else. An employer can also be held liable. And I guess your question, Giti, is who can be held liable in the streets? And I suppose it just, you know, I think one of the things sometimes when you research in this area or you teach in this area is you basically think, yeah, all of it. Yes, it's about urban planning. Yes, it's about the economy. Yes, it's about the media. Yes, it's about the law. Yes, it's about, it's all of those things. And that goes back, I think, to the point you made really forcefully, that we don't achieve equality in one space. It's got to be in all of them, or that one space is always kind of under threat, suspicion.
I want to see folks take accountability at a very personal level. I know, and I appreciate what you're saying about it needs the all of it part, the urban planning, the community support, the elements that the non-policing elements, particularly the discussions that we've seen so forcefully and importantly in the United States after police violence got center stage in the media, that I want to see personal accountability for people who are most closely connected to those who commit these crimes. I want people to, if we're talking about men committing violent acts against anyone in the workplace, and if that's more in public places rather, that moment of understanding how it sounds absurd to say how inappropriate it is, and yet so under-addressed, under-discussed, making it the sphere of women to address and discuss rather than the individuals committing the crimes, making the public spaces unsafe, is what strikes me as so wild. And part of this, and part of the discussion, and something that gives me hope, is seeing for instance, the discussions that we had in the United States over the summer about imagining the ability to walk down the street if you're a Black person in the United States without fear of police violence, and what that feels like. And you need to be able to imagine a world where this isn't the problem. And I am struck by something that I heard, that a not seriously proposed proposal that there be a 6 p.m. curfew for men on the streets in London. I don't know how much of that, but a question that I had heard asked before was, what would I feel like if there was a curfew for men after dark? What are the things that I would do as a woman in Washington, D.C. that I wouldn't do otherwise? And we don't necessarily think about the way we make our world smaller to fit our sense of safety. And I want it to expand out so that that safety is there for everyone.
I saw a post, I think it was by Rebecca Solnit, and she put up this thing where, if all men were taken out of the public spaces and confined to their homes for a day, what would you do? And there was this range of answers, and I forget now where it is, but is it in Brazil? I could be wrong, so where they're actually planning to do this, have like a festival day where there will be no men allowed on the streets and it'll be only women. But yeah, imagination to put yourself in that space and to think it through.
That imagination is really powerful, but it also, there's been some, for all the last week has been absolutely grim. I think one of the legacies of Me Too, also of Black Lives Matter, is that there is now some excellent politicized mainstream commentary that gets this. There's also lots that doesn't, let's not be over enthusiastic about it, but there is some that does. And actually, one thing I've been reading on a couple of different sources, and if you don't know the blog Language, A Feminist Guide by the feminist linguist Debbie Cameron, I can't recommend it highly enough. But she and also Liz Kelly have both written this week about the problem with thinking about women's safety. And it's another one of those things that has really, I hadn't thought about properly musically before. And actually, in terms of what you were just describing this festival, I think it fits more with what they talk about, that we need to imagine freedom rather than their safety, because their safety is always about constraint, if you like, and protection, whereas freedom is about none of that exists. We don't need protection because the problem has gone. And I think, to me, that was one of those really, a bit like the Rebecca Solnit quote that you, or post that you mentioned, it is that thing where you think, yeah, what if we did think about this differently? What if we did talk about this differently? You know, what if, as you were saying, we move away from liability to accountability, for instance? I mean, all these shifts, they're representational, they're linguistic, but they're also legal, they're cultural. I mean, the ripple effect can be powerful.
Yeah. I also just really liked, Karen, if I can go back to your point about, you know, survivor stories and the way that at least one aspect has been a kind of fetishization of personal trauma, you know, in the public sphere. And yeah, I mean, how messy that area is in centering the survivor, if we're thinking about survivor-centered justice. But also not putting the burden of testimony on the survivor's shoulders. And I wondered if you could just, you know, say a little bit more there, because I understand exactly what you're saying. It's just that it is such a messy area to actually work in. Rochelle McPhee's got a great chapter in the book that you must have seen, where she actually talks about what happens to the survivor's voice in the revolution. It's often not what the survivor wants. So
I think that's there's a couple of different things going on there. I mean, when I'm talking about testimony, I'm talking about social media testimony, often that's anonymous, that doesn't name perpetrators, sometimes because those perpetrators are never known, right? Particularly at the moment, things about street harassment. Often this is someone who you may only occupy the same space with for 5 minutes or 2 minutes, or, you know, so sometimes those perpetrators are never known. So I'm not talking about testimony in a legal sense. So in that sense, I'm not talking about the justice system, as it were. But this also really struck home for me, because I was reading an article by a friend of Sarah Everett's talking about the protests that are happening currently are not what she would have wanted. Now that obviously we're talking here about someone who didn't survive. And it's really given me pause for thought as to who owns these stories, in a sense, and what our responsibility is to the people in those stories, at the same point in time as the issues in those stories are always bigger than the people, if that makes sense.
absolutely.
And in terms of I always feel really awkward saying anything about not awkward, that's not the word. I would certainly never want it to be construed that I'm saying I don't value survivor testimony. I do. Mm-hmm. But I just think we have a lot of survivor testimony. We know there's a problem, and that's why we need to shift the discourse. And one of the problems is that whenever something, you know, like whenever there's a story like the one we've had in the UK over the last week about this horrendous crime, the onus shouldn't be on us to tell those stories again.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Sorry, I see Emma Flynn has her hand up. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question, or do you want to put it in the chat? Emma?
Hi, sorry, I was just waiting for myself to be unmuted there. My question is sort of for Karen, and I'm not expecting a full answer here. I was just wondering if you could talk a wee bit about it for us, and it's kind of related to what you were just saying there, Giti. And I've struggled and grappled with the same thing over the past week, that you've discussed this imperative to speak out and the pressure to speak out. And I think for a lot of young feminists, particularly of who I'm sort of in that group at the moment still, we feel, or not we feel, but that there is an impulse to want to share a story that you've silenced yourself on for so long. And I do find it, and I share the same concerns as you, and I wonder if you could talk a bit about how we might speak about these things without sounding like we're trying to silence stories, without making people feel that they're being re-silenced, because I think obviously the issue as well comes down to the fact that this constant outpouring a testimony can also be somewhat re-traumatizing, and it can be quite upsetting to you know, come away from doing your work, your daily work, the work that many of us do on sexual violence, and then read this outpouring of testimony. So I was just wondering if you could talk a bit about how we might speak about these things, or if there was a way that we could use a space in which we could use survivor speech pragmatically and turn it into activism, so people have that space to talk about it and they don't feel silenced, perhaps.
Thanks, Emma. A couple of things come to mind. One is thinking about contexts in which we can facilitate survivor speech. And I would never say that are safe spaces, because I'm not entirely sure such things exist, but are supported spaces. So one of the things that worries me slightly about some of the testimonial hashtags is they get that kind of imperative you're talking about. And I think there is research talking to women who have posted and shared Me Too or been raped, never reported, about what that experience of posting that has been like, and often that's been really positive and transformational and powerful. But if you're speaking those things on a platform like Twitter or Facebook, you're not speaking them in the context of, say, a consciousness raising group in the 1970s. You're putting that speech out there and you don't know what you're going to get back. And what you might get back is, you know, further abuse. Your employer might, you know, how does your employer look at you after they've read this story? How do your tutors or your students, or, you know, there's a vulnerability about public speech, and there shouldn't be in one sense, because there should never ever be any shame in being victimized or in surviving, or indeed in still feeling victimized. But I think both the great power of the social media testimonials and their great limitation, if you like, is that they are this kind of they are in this sort of unruly space. And I suppose, so the other thing I was going to say there, Emma, is I also think about the work of organisations like Rape Crisis or the Clear Lines Festival in the UK, who support survivors to tell their stories that are safe and meaningful to them, so that survivors are telling their stories on their terms when the time is right for them, not when a hashtag demands it of them, and not when a media agency demands it of them. And I think that kind of, how do we, and then I think one of the other things media organisations can do is not always be phoning Rape Crisis and saying, right, we've got a story about this, could you find us a woman who'd been abducted off the street and raped who'll talk to us? And I'm saying that flippantly, but that's what happens all the time. I'm sure it happens in other contexts too. And actually phone instead those organisations and say, can you tell us about your experience of supporting women who have been through this? And so recast it differently, so that it's not always women having to tell their stories. They absolutely, if they want to, they can and should be supported to. But sometimes we actually look at the go-betweens, the people who've maybe heard a lot of these stories, so that it's not the pressure put on the individual. Because the other problem when the pressure is put on the individual is that it becomes totally about their behaviour, right? Where was she going? What was she doing? What was she wearing? And that's one of the ways in which I want to be really, you know, yay for hashtags, because if you scroll one of these hashtags and you get, she was doing this and this, there is, you know, the pattern is she was being female in public, right? Or in the workplace or whatever. So it does offer a kind of challenge in one sense, but the imperative to speak out always worries me.
Mm-hmm. Audrey, I was wondering if I could just get a little more information, clarification, you know, complaints mechanisms in the workplace, in especially in the United States. I don't know if there's like a uniform kind of template that most companies are forced to follow or do follow or whatever. The part of what worries me is that the decision at the end is made by someone who's within the company, who is ahead, or you know, who is in a position of power over everybody else, who makes the final decision through these. So I was just wondering, you know, some clarity there. Does it help if the head of the institution is in charge of deciding what happens in a particular complaint. So if the chain of command goes up,
it's incredible. Just looking right now about, the fox is running the hen house, right? That's a thing that we're seeing all the time. I'm a New Yorker, and looking at what's happening in New York State right now is astounding to me. So don't expect folks to be familiar with New York State politics, but leadership in attempting to change how we approach Me Too from a business perspective, creating good standards when it comes to accountability, policies, processes, for instance, complaint mechanisms. There is now a standard complaint mechanism required by New York State. In the time since that became the law, the Attorney General for New York State had committed tremendous crimes against his girlfriends and others. This is Eric Schneiderman. And now we're seeing the governor of New York State, Andrew Cuomo, being accused of sexual harassment and other misdeeds. And these are the individuals for whom you're absolutely right. If we are not holding the people at the top accountable for their wrongdoing, then your best systems are worthless. That, we'd say that and $2.75 gets you a ride on the subway, right? They mean nothing. So what we see is that you may not have the same systems, you may not have the same complaint mechanisms, but what we do see is that in institutions that take these complaints seriously, it doesn't matter if it comes in a carrier pigeon. How you do it, if you're doing that, you have that impartial, thorough, prompt investigation that gets to the bottom of this, and people are held accountable with a proportionate response for their wrongdoing, then we're able to make people trust the organization, trust the system. It makes such a difference.
Yeah, I was actually kind of thinking within like university systems, which are the ones I'm familiar with, where eventually, whatever your committee of, who makes the decision, who does the investigation and so on, is often headed by the head of the institution. And of course, the head of the institution more often than not thinks about the health of the institution rather than the health of the person who's been harassed. And seniority, fundraising abilities, blah, 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 everything comes into this decision making, the reputation of the institution. And there've been very, very visible, very public cases of this around the world, but of course in the US. So I was kind of wondering, just the feasibility of how well a complaint system can work if the head of the institution is going to be the final arbiter of justice in a case.
It's truly very difficult. And that's why we've seen recommendations, and I think these are really good ones, to have an outside ombudsperson, independent investigation mechanisms happening outside of the institution itself, because you're right, the incentives are there to value the health of the institution over the rights, the freedom, the safety of individuals to exist in that space. That's absolutely a problem we see quite often. And there are good solutions to that. If you're willing to say, we're gonna, this rainmaker or this most powerful, this most famous person, it's not worth it to keep them if it comes at the expense of other safety.
I mean, I think so, and you think so, but.
Well, we see certain instances where that happens, but right, we're still, I don't think we're going to see that in New York State for Governor Cuomo, but.
No. I wonder if there's any responses from our audience, if anyone wants to just make a comment or ask a question. I'm kind of looking at my chat and I don't see anything there. So because we have 2 minutes, we're kind of out of time. And I just want to say how fabulous it was just to have both of you here. To hear you put out such difficult, complex, messy issues just so much more clearly, to make it possible for everyone to think our way through this this stuff. I just, for every time that you say, Karen, that we've heard these stories, I think back to how surprised I was at the surprise of so many men when the Me Too movement happened. They're like, what? I'm like, where have you been living? Why are you surprised? How do you not know this? And it seems like we're fighting this constantly, you know, uphill battle. It's very sort of Sisyphean, really. You roll that rock up and 3 years later, it's back down at the bottom of the hill again.
And that's where I think, you know, getting rid of this metaphor that it's breaking the silence is actually really quite important, because it's not breaking the silence. It's people listening. That's the difference.
Yeah. And language matters.
Even in the really, really high profile cases around Weinstein, for instance, many of the women told people right from the very beginning. So it wasn't that they finally broke their silence. It was that people decided what they said mattered.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Language matters. Not that something happened to Sarah, but somebody did something to her. It's, yeah. Gosh, we could go on for another hour, but I would like to thank both of you enormously for the time that you've put in here and made it possible for us all to think through this stuff a little more clearly. Thank you ever so much. This has been recorded. It will go on online, and I'm hoping that lots of other people will watch it and maybe get back to you with comments and so on. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for our audience being here as well. And it's live on Facebook, so I'm assuming there's more people there.